Revolutionary talk for revolutionary times. Promoting peace, liberty, and prosperity around the clock. LibertyTalk.fm.
Welcome to Living in the Solution with Dr. Elena George. Today we have a really important show on, one I'm looking forward to. We have a lot of changes in our education system. And what really fascinates me is what's going on in the homeschooling space. Children have been forced to stay home. They haven't been able to go to school. And it's in Georgia, it's 50% on, 50% off. It's driving parents, I think, a little bit to frustration because there's no rhyme or reason at this moment. But there is a movement that's starting, and I don't think it's new, but I think it's picking up speed, and that's homeschooling. There's been a lot of heat with various teachers' unions, and I'm not sure where they stand actually. And I'm going to ask our next guest what the force driving this is. Is it the parents? Is it the fact the schools aren't open? Did this precede COVID? And we're going to get a lot of answers, but more importantly, we're going to get, solutions for parents, because everybody wants the best for their child, and it's not a one size fits all scenario. And I think that people need to know that. So today we're going to speak with Miss Kerry McDonald. She's a senior education fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education and the author of Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom. She's a regular contributor for Forbes, and she's also an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. Her research interests include homeschooling and alternatives to school, self-directed learning, education, entrepreneurship, parent empowerment, school choice, and family and child policy. Her articles have appeared at the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, NPR, Education Next, Reason Magazine, City Journal, and Entrepreneur, among others. She has a master's degree in education policy from Harvard University and a bachelor's degree in economics from Bowdoin College. She lives in Massachusetts with her children and husband, and she's somebody who can speak to this on many levels and has been writing about this for quite a while. So, Ms. McDonald, I'd like to thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Dr. George. I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, I guess the first question I have for you is, what started you down this path of exploring homeschooling? Because I remember when I was in school, nobody did. I'm not that old, but I don't remember anybody really homeschooling. How did we start down this road?
Yeah, I'll tell you a little bit of my personal story, and then we can talk about the homeschooling movement more generally. But like you, I grew up, never knew a homeschooler, didn't know much about homeschooling. I went to K-12 public schools and then went off to college and became an economics major, as you mentioned. But I grew increasingly interested in education and applying economic thinking to education policy. So I started taking some education classes as an undergraduate. And for my senior year, I was able to do an independent research project, and I decided to explore homeschooling. Now, this was, at the time, the late 1990s. Homeschooling had just become legally recognized in all 50 states just a few years prior, by the mid-1990s. And the first year that the U.S. Department of Education began tracking homeschoolers was in 1999. They counted about 850,000. So it was still really a nascent movement and not anywhere near kind of the mainstream education option that it's become. So I was fascinated to learn a little bit more about homeschooling and its rise and its practice. So that semester, for this independent research project, I ended up shadowing a homeschooling family that lived nearby. And I remember walking into this family's kitchen for the first time at the beginning of the semester and just being completely captivated by what I saw. Just a really nurturing, creative learning environment, a child, in this case, who was about 8 or 9 years old at the time, who was very gregarious and interesting and at ease with strangers and adults. And really, as I began to kind of follow this family, realized that this child had this authentic socialization in the larger community, interacting with all kinds of different people, all kinds of different ages, different experiences, mentors that she had in the community, peers that she had. And what was really fascinating was that it was such a contrast to that same semester when I was doing a student teaching practicum in a local public elementary school with the same age, second graders, the same age students as this homeschooled child. And the contrast was just striking. And of course, I never really appreciated this contrast because I had gone to public school. It was the only kind of learning environment that I was familiar with. And then seeing kind of this outside of the conventional classroom learning experience contrasted with the kind of standardized command and control kind of environment in public schools, an age segregated classroom, standardized curriculum, kind of one size fits all learning, was just really, really startling and really started me thinking about, the inadequacies really of a one size fits all government schooling system. So then I went to graduate school in education policy at Harvard, as you mentioned, and became increasingly interested in expanding education choice to families and all kinds of different education options. Charter schools were just coming on the scene, so I spent a lot of time focusing on them, and then, kind of gradually expanded to advocating for more and more not only alternative education models, but schooling alternatives more broadly. And then when I became a mom myself years later, homeschooling had always been in the back of my mind, and realized as my husband and I were looking at education choices for our own kids, we live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, we realized that they were surrounded by these wonderful community resources, programming, lots of different peers and mentors in the community. This kind of immersive, authentic learning, authentic socialization with the people, places, and things around us. And we really felt that if we had sent them to school, their learning would contract, that instead of this kind of vibrant learning experience in the larger community, they would be going to the same building every day with the same, again, age segregated group of kids and the same static handful of teachers. And we wanted to provide a much more expansive education environment for them. So that's how we started. And then, of course, my work professionally is also focused around education policy and expanding education options for families, including homeschooling.
That's just a wonderful synopsis of the power of the parent, really. I mean, I was fortunate. I went to a school that was 13 people in my graduating class, and I was there from grade 1 through 12. And we had a very organic, it wasn't cookie cutter, it was Socratic method, go at your own pace if you wanted to. And it was about really incorporating what the best part of what being a child was. And I'm not sure that's really what goes on now. And I would be curious to know, from your perspective, you just mentioned something about it being very rigid, very staid. Is there, compared to, it's kind of a loaded question, but compared to homeschooling, why do you think that it is so rigid in the standard education system? It doesn't seem to want to make children who are organically able to interact and be intellectually curious. Is that something am I thinking that, or is that how education really is on the macro level?
Yeah, part of it is by design, right? So in my Unschooled book, I go through a lot of the history of American compulsory schooling dating back to the mid-19th century. The first compulsory schooling law was passed in 1852 here in Massachusetts. And for the first time, parents were required to send their children to a common school under a legal threat of force. And prior to that, there was really a wide variety of different education options. There were public schools, there were private schools. Homeschooling, of course, was the default prior to compulsory schooling. Apprenticeship programs were abundant and was certainly the kind of stepping stone into adulthood for most children. So all of that kind of contracted into the four walls of the common school classroom in the mid-19th century with this standardized curriculum, standardized teacher training. You had those normal schools, which were the teacher academies that came on the scene that were also meant to kind of standardize the ways in which teachers were taught, so that everything about that learning experience would be standardized. And, it is worth pointing out, I think, because we look back on this now and think, oh my goodness, it was so industrial. It was kind of this factory model of education tied to the Industrial Revolution. And there's a lot of truth to that. But it's also important to remember that at the time, this was an innovation. The Industrial Revolution was extraordinary. And so it was this sense of efficiency and cost effectiveness and standardization of labor that was truly innovative at the time. And then, of course, that gets injected into the public school system. The issue is, however, that we are now in the 21st century, and move past this industrial revolution into the information age. And what I argue in my book is more the imagination era, where creativity and human ingenuity and inventiveness are really the key qualities that distinguish humans from robots, or from these factory models. And yet we still are stuck with an outdated 19th century model of education that focuses on standardized curriculum and compliance and obedience. And of course, we doubled down on that with the passage of No Child Left Behind at the turn of the millennium, which and the expansion of Common Core and regular standardized testing that was mandated at the federal level. So, if anything, I think we focused even more on making standardized learning the focus of our classrooms, as opposed to really encouraging some of these key qualities that are essential for the realities of the 21st century.
Well, I'd like to, take that a little further when we come back, because I'm curious to know how the children who are homeschooled compare with because I'm sure there's pressure to say that, and again, I think there's an economic component we probably need to discuss too, that homeschooling is not as good as general education, and the money should be spent in one way, in one pot that serves the good of the many kind of thing. So let's take a break and come back and pick that up. You're living in the solution. Welcome back to Living the Solution. We're speaking with Miss Kerry McDonald. She's a senior education fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education and the author of Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom. And before the break, it just made me think about my mantra of follow the money. When kids are homeschooled, I assume that there must be a little bit of pushback from the standardized education set, because money follows the child, doesn't it? So if you have less children in the seats in a public education platform, does that mean that they get less money? And is that something that's causing pushback?
So no, they don't receive any less money than they would if a parent chooses to send their kid to a private school. So it's exactly the same thing. Parents opting out of the public school system, whether that's for private school or homeschooling, it's less enrollment in that public school, but homeschoolers are not any different in terms of numbers or calculations from the public school perspective. Now, there's more pushback, more ideologically, around wanting to control parents and have kind of more oversight of homeschooling families. And last year in June, I was able to debate live Professor Elizabeth Bartholet from Harvard Law School, who made waves last spring with her Arizona Law Review article calling for a presumptive ban on homeschooling. And so that was interesting to really be able to get at and to debate her against, some of these misperceptions that she had about homeschooling, certainly in the modern time, and some of the stereotypes that really linger about homeschooling.
Well, actually, is there any? I've noticed that the curriculum is expanded in some instances, where some homeschooling families are using the curriculum the same one that's running in schools. Am I wrong? Or is it really that parents have the freedom to teach their kids as they choose? And obviously, there's some sort of standardized test, I would think, that all children have to take at some point. But is there a movement towards trying to backdoor, capture children in this system?
It's actually, the states vary. So homeschooling regulations are at the state level. Homeschooling is legal in all 50 states. And many states don't require any kind of standardized testing. And most states allow full freedom and flexibility of families in terms of how they want to teach their children, what kinds of curriculum that they want to use. Many states have no homeschooling reporting requirements at all. Some have more oversight requirements, although the trend in recent years has been towards less regulation, which I would argue is a good thing, to give families, more autonomy over how their children learn and the curriculum and learning resources they use.
Well, actually, I was curious to know about the parents. What's the demographic? And I read one of your articles about the diversity of parents who decided to homeschool their children.
Yeah.
And I was actually a little surprised that there was a growing number of Black American parents who are homeschooling their children. Is that trend still occurring?
Not only is it occurring, it has taken off. So it might be worth now kind of moving to the present and sharing a little bit about what's happened in terms of independent homeschooling over the past year, really. So the Census Bureau, the U.S. Census Bureau, just 2 weeks ago came out with some recent data on the rate of independent homeschooling. And we had seen other surveys and other data throughout the last 6 months from Gallup, for example, and Education Week, showing similar results. But the Census Bureau was pretty definitive and really extraordinary in what they're finding. So what they discovered was that independent homeschoolers now represent over 11% of the U.S. K-12 school population. Just since the pandemic. And to give that some perspective, that's over 5.5 million students, on par with the number of students who attend a private school in the country. And prior to the pandemic, in the years preceding 2020, the most recent U.S. federal Department of Education data on homeschoolers suggested that there were about 1.7 million homeschoolers. That might have been undercounted, but that was the most recent federal data that we had. And that was about 3.3% of the U.S. K-12 school age population. So we've tripled during really since prior to the pandemic, and now over the past year, tripled the number of homeschoolers. And this is actually defined as families who have removed their children from school or who have delayed schooling in the case if their children were about to be enrolled in kindergarten, for example, and have chosen to identify as independent homeschoolers. Now, what's also really extraordinary in the Census Bureau data that just came out was that homeschoolers of all races and ethnicities had increased, and families of color, homeschoolers of color, had increased over the past year. But for Black homeschoolers, the percentage increased 5 times from last spring, 5-fold from last spring to this winter, counting over 16% of homeschoolers are now Black, and that compares to 15% in the K-12 public school population, according to federal data. So we have this overrepresentation now of Black homeschoolers, and this rate had been increasing. The rate of Black homeschoolers, for example, doubled between 2008 and 2012, but was still underrepresented in the overall homeschool population. And now we see this overrepresentation. We also have high rates of Hispanic homeschoolers and Asian homeschoolers, and all of those groups increased their representation in homeschooling over the past year.
Now, this is a question that I'm just curious about. Is it physically because of COVID, or because parents really wanted to take more control over their child's education and have more of a say-so, have it be less rigid?
I really think it's a combination of the two. So when the school shutdowns first began last spring, and we had about 50 million U.S. school children suddenly displaced from their classrooms and learning at home alongside their families, it was disruptive for everyone. But early on, there were some signals that maybe things weren't all that bad, that some families were actually appreciating this newer opportunity to learn alongside their kids, or maybe provide some flexibility in their learning. Ed Choice, for example, came out with one of the first surveys in April. They surveyed parents on a wide variety of education topics related to the pandemic and the shutdowns. And they found at that time that more than half of the parents had a more favorable view of homeschooling than they did prior to the pandemic. And of course, this was a time when we're all completely separated from our communities. It hit homeschoolers just as hard as it hit other families whose kids were in school, because we were all separated from our wider, support networks and community resources. And so I thought, gosh, if parents think this is good, just imagine the real thing. Mm-hmm. And sure enough, every month that Ed Choice has surveyed parents, they've found this favorability to increase. Even as recently as this past February, they now count that 63% of parents have a more favorable view of homeschooling than they did prior to the pandemic. So I think some of it is just parents were able to experience a different way of learning with their kids, and maybe really gravitated towards that. I think another reason is that parents maybe got a glimpse at what their kids were learning or were not learning through Zoom school last spring or throughout the fall. And that might have provided a catalyst for families to take charge. I think other families might have always been curious about homeschooling or a different kind of learning environment for their kids, but lacked that catalyst to give it a go. And this provided that opportunity. And then, yes, I think there's certainly still concerns about the virus that many families have, and that could have been a factor, as well as I think the unpredictability and the uncertainty of school reopening plans or hybrid learning. And some districts have still been remote for over a year now. In fact, only 40% of school districts across the country are currently open for full-time in-person schooling, and the remaining 60% are either hybrid or remote. Only. So I think for a lot of families, they just felt like being independent homeschoolers, unenrolling their children from school would provide some consistency, maybe more academic rigor than they would be getting otherwise this year.
Well, I'm curious. I've heard so many things about the children who are homeschooling and doing remote learning, not homeschooling from parents doing it, but just doing what the schools are allowing them to do. They're all falling, not all, but most are falling behind. And it's having an effect on their emotional well-being. I love being a student. I didn't like when things didn't work out. So if you're falling behind, you feel like you're not catching up, I wonder how much that has an effect on what children feel. And I'd like you to answer that if you can when you come back. You're living in the solution. Welcome back to Living the Solution. We're speaking with Ms. McDonald, and before the break, the emotional toll that this is taking on children who like school, who did well in school before this, but know that they're behind. Let's start with apples and apples, I guess. Are the children who are homeschooled on average, are they well caught up, or are they feeling that they're behind too? And how do they compare to their, if you can answer, their counterparts who are doing remote learning?
Right. So I think there's a couple of things there. The first is that the kind of Zoom schooling that we've been seeing over the past year with kids doing their district schooling from home has been, really disastrous for a lot of children. There are reports of more failures than ever before, and kids really falling behind. Some kids just disappearing, and the school doesn't know, where they are. It's really, I think, been a challenge, in particular in a lot of districts, those certainly that are remote only. And so I think for a lot of families, they realize that they should take matters into their own hands and guide their children's education themselves without relying on this Zoom schooling. Now, we don't have data kind of at the micro level over the past year comparing these, say, 5.5 million current homeschoolers to their Zoom school peers. But what we do have is data prior to the pandemic, and extensive data showing independent homeschooling outcomes compared to schooled peers. One of the most comprehensive is a literature review that was conducted recently by Lindsay Burke of the Heritage Foundation Education, who finds excellent academic outcomes for homeschooled students, finds that the homeschooled students generally outperform their schooled peers and have solid rates of education achievement, both at the K-12 level and do fine in college as well, should they choose to attend. So those outcomes, I think, are positive. And a lot of that, of course, has to do with parental involvement and parents, really wanting the best for their children's education and taking that step to pull them from school and to direct their education. And I will just, because I think it's an important point to make, that the sort of stereotype of homeschoolers as sitting around the kitchen table, replicating school at home, having a parent, usually a mother, going through textbooks over the kitchen table. I don't know that was ever really true. I think it was always a caricature of homeschooling, certainly over the last couple of decades. But it's certainly not true now. You have so many resources, even in the pandemic, even with in-person classes canceled in a lot of places for homeschoolers and others. For example, my library is still closed here and our museums are just starting to open. But even with that, there's just so many online learning resources, many of which are free or very low cost for families. And I think that was another thing that parents really discovered over the past year was, hey, I don't have to be sitting around directing my child's education and teaching them. I can connect them to these incredible resources and tools that help to do the teaching, and I can just facilitate and help help out where needed. And so that took a lot of pressure off for families. And of course, many families are working from home. And so families have more flexibility in many cases than they might have had prior to the pandemic. The Brookings Institution coming out with a research paper last summer finding that teleworking would continue even after the pandemic ends. And so I think that this elevated level of homeschooling, of independent homeschooling, is likely to continue, particularly as parents have more freedom and flexibility in their work. In many cases, they'll want to grant that same kind of freedom and flexibility to their kids as well.
Well, just looking at the diversity, we talked about the diversity of the racial diversity.
Yeah.
What about the economic diversity? And you mentioned you brushed against it, but what about the parents who can't stay at home? Do you find, have they been able to access this system? Have they found a strategy that works for them when there are two parents working and they may not be in the household, but they want to do this?
Yeah, so this is another myth, I think, that gets propagated, and certainly we've heard it over the past year as well, and it was true before. The reality is that homeschoolers, on average, the population of homeschoolers, even before the pandemic, was less affluent than average. So that's important to remember, that there's this, I think, myth that these are more privileged families or more affluent families that are choosing homeschooling. And in fact, the opposite is true. It's certainly been true during the pandemic that it's actually low-income families that are choosing homeschooling at higher rates than any other group. So Education Week in November reported, at that point, they counted homeschooling numbers at 9%. Again, that compares to the new Census Bureau data, which puts it at just over 11% of the K-12 school-age population that's homeschooled. So the Education Week survey had it at 9%, and they found that low-income families were the families more likely to be choosing homeschooling this year, which is really interesting. I think that also correlates with the fact that we saw a real decline in public school enrollment this academic year, as many families decided to exit the public school system because of, maybe delayed back to school plans, or again, this uncertainty and unpredictability, or just dissatisfaction with reopening and some of the social distancing requirements, or all-day mask wearing, or all these kinds of factors that might have turned some families off for having their kids be in these spaces all day. So we saw a real exodus from public schools and a decline in enrollment in almost all U.S. states as a result. Many of these families choosing private school options, and many choosing independent homeschooling. And I think for a lot of families, in that case, homeschooling might be the more cost-effective approach rather than paying tuition at a private school.
Yeah, knowing how much they charge, I have to agree with you. It's like college rate, medical school rate for tuition these days. So how do people get started? I mean, people have this mindset that, it must be a teacher who's teaching their own children. But as you described, this is a cross section of parents jumping in. Is there some sort of resource that if you wanted to get involved that you would recommend parents go to and start the process so they can educate themselves?
Well, they could always grab a copy of my Unschooled book
There you go.
if they're interested. And there's all kinds of books and literature to read. I think that's a great place to start. It's funny, my book came out. It's called Unschooled: Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom. It was published in the spring of 2019. But actually saw surging sales last spring as the school shutdowns began, and that's continued steadily over the past year. So I think that there really is an interest in learning about these other models that maybe families never really thought about before. And the school shutdowns all of a sudden kind of opened their eyes to different learning options, whether it was homeschooling or even high quality online learning. You know, I think one of the real unfortunate parts of Zoom schooling and the difficulty that a lot of students have had with this remote schooling. I think one of the real tragedies of that is that it gives a bad name to online learning overall. And in fact, there's tremendous high quality, highly effective online learning programs, many of which were created and designed to be online learning programs. So it wasn't just something that like a Zoom school that districts just had to back into. So I hope families realize that even though their district Zoom school might not be satisfactory, that there are some other wonderful online learning resources that really can be engaging and effective for their kids. And I think so. I think parents are really, seeing that there's all these kinds of options for them outside of their district school. So start with my book, but beyond, or any book, but beyond that, my first piece of advice would be for families to research local homeschooling groups, particularly local Facebook groups. Sometimes there's local Google groups or local Yahoo groups, although that all seems to be migrating over to Facebook, certainly in my area. Or you could Google, your city or state and homeschooling and find the resources that come up near you. And what you'll find when you connect with that local community is you'll get advice on how to comply with your state-specific regulation. What do you need to do to become an independent homeschooler? But you'll also get a lot of different tips and insights around where to begin, what kinds of curriculum to choose, what is your philosophy of education, how do you want to approach learning. You might get some insights on deschooling. If your kids have been in school for a while, maybe they need to sort of deprogram a little bit so that they can rekindle that love of learning and that creative spark that all young children naturally have, but that sometimes can be eroded with this sort of standardized one-size-fits-all learning model.
When I picture what you're saying about the Zoom versus the homeschool mentality, I picture that the parent is there for the most part with the child as opposed to some screen talking to them. There's no way I would have paid attention to something at that age because you're distracted, you're otherwise engaged. I just can't imagine you can keep a child's and a teen's attention without an actual adult being there with them. Am I right in thinking that that's what it looks like when you're homeschooling? So that the parent is there to answer questions, that there's kind of a give and take as opposed to the child just getting it, just coming at them.
Right. I mean, I think it depends. So right now, depending on where you are in the country, here in Massachusetts, things are still pretty locked down. There's, still not a lot of in-person classes or programming happening for anybody. So, prior to the pandemic, for example, my kids would be spending more of their time outside of my home than inside, often taking classes with other teachers. And, because even before the pandemic, the rate of homeschooling was increasing, a lot of local organizations, museums, libraries really catered to homeschooling and had daytime programming geared towards that population. So it's that kind of thing where you have these kind of community mentors and peer groups that homeschooled kids would be interacting with. So it's not just the parent. Now it's a little bit trickier with the pandemic response and all of the shutdowns. I think more of the burden falls on parents, but that doesn't mean that, kids aren't doing things autonomously. I mean, one of the resources that I love to tout that my kids participate in as well is Khan Academy, which is kind of the leader in online learning videos for students. It's completely free. It's a nonprofit. It's used in many public schools across the country. They're known in particular for their math education, but they have all kinds of different learning videos on different topics. And they've really ramped up their resources throughout the pandemic, including lesson plans and daily guides for parents of kids of all ages.
Mm-hmm.
But so if my kids are doing math or, say 8th grade math through Khan Academy, so there's an adult around if they need help, but the videos are really good, and the ways that it's organized are really self-paced for kids too. And then parents can kind of see and check to make sure that the kids are getting it and focus on areas that they may be struggling in. But it doesn't have to just be the parent again. I mean, I think that's the other piece of it, that you have tutors and you have mentors in the community, or you have these other classes that families can take advantage of.
It sounds very structured. On that note, let's take our last break and come back. You're living in the solution. Welcome back to Living the Solution. We're speaking with Miss McDonald, the author of Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom. And the website, I think you can go there and see what she's written. She has a lot of excellent pieces. It's fee.org. And that's the website for the Foundation for Economic Education. Do you have a blog, outside of that, or a Facebook page or something that people can go directly to you as well?
Right. So the best place to reach me is fee.org, as you mentioned, /Kerry, Kerry. And there you'll find the link to my book. You'll see links to all my social media accounts. You'll be able to send me an email, and you'll also see all of my recent articles. I typically write at least a weekly article at Fee. You can also sign up for my weekly parenting and education email newsletter. So fee.org /Kerry, Kerry, is the best place to connect.
Awesome. Now, I just wanted to ask, we talked a lot about the academic side. Let's talk a bit about the social side, because you have this mentality of children being, and with COVID, away from each other, not necessarily, interacting with their loved ones and their friends as they used to. And it's all virtual sometimes, especially if you're in a lockdown situation. How is before COVID? Let's go before COVID, after COVID. How was because you mentioned at the beginning, the child that you knew or you talked about was very well-rounded, could interact in any social situation. Did that transfer overall to a homeschool child versus a child in the typical educational system?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Daniel Hamlin from the University of Oklahoma did a study on homeschooling and what he called cultural capital. And he found, and he compared homeschoolers to public school students, and he found that homeschooled students had much higher rates of cultural capital. They were more likely to go to a library, a museum, a cultural event, a community event, a historic site, a bookstore, a zoo, all of these community events, much more likely to do that than a student who was in public school. So there is this much greater immersion into the larger community that you find with homeschoolers. Now, of course, you're right. During the pandemic, this has been a challenge for everybody, homeschoolers and schooled families as well. And I think this is where, I've written a lot throughout the past year about, parents making sure that you're able to find opportunities for your kids to connect safely with other kids, to avoid this kind of loneliness epidemic that we're seeing spiraling over the past year, and high rates of youth depression and anxiety because of these lockdowns. And of course, it affects everybody, but it's particularly troubling when it affects young people. So I think it's up to parents to really make sure that they're providing these social opportunities for kids. And this is where it's been a great innovation to come out of the past year, are what were known as pandemic pods or learning pods that you and your listeners might have heard about. this came on the scene last summer, as a lot of parents were trying to envision what the fall back to school season or not back to school season would look like, whatever the case may be. And they decided that they wanted to still provide their kids with some kind of social interaction in small groups with peers, but do so safely and in a kind of controlled environment. Because at this time, in many places, so to say the early summer, some kids hadn't seen other kids in a couple of months. And so they were trying to figure out what to do. And so all of a sudden, pandemic pods made headlines across the country as families got together spontaneously and organically to connect with each other and gather a group of kids who would, learn together and have this social connection while learning. And either parents would take turns guiding the curriculum or homeschooling, or they would pool their resources to hire a teacher or a college student to do that. And in some cases, these pods were families who did unenroll their children from school to independently homeschool them. In other cases, they were families who were all enrolled in a district that was remaining remote, and they still wanted their kids not to just be sitting alone or independently in their homes, but actually have some safe social interaction. So in that case, they've just offered up their homes or maybe rotated homes and allowed their kids to do remote schooling from their district, but do that together in their little pods. So that's been a great innovation and really came on the heels of pre-pandemic, what were known as micro school networks. Which in some ways are sort of a timely take on traditional homeschool co-ops, these sort of small in-home learning environments that often involved outside educators, but families really coming up with these kind of spontaneous solutions to, in this case, this year, a really challenging problem.
Well, it's really positive. I mean, anything this show is about solutions, and anything that's going to help remove uncertainty, anxiety, and help you move forward. And I think the family unit is extremely important. Friendships are very important. I mean, this is the future of our society. And if children aren't well acclimated to change, I mean, this is I would say this is not how you want change to occur because it's not organic. But the fact that they have a reserve and an ability to think outside the box. I mean, part of your mission is talking about entrepreneurship, right? So that's the ability to go from an unknown and take a positive take on it as opposed to a negative one. Is that how you see these children going forward? I mean, they're able to thrive, not just survive.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that maybe a silver lining from the past year has been the boost in entrepreneurship overall. A lot of people starting businesses. In fact, the Wall Street Journal reported last fall there was a highest rate of new business starts in over a decade. So that was a positive sign. People may be displaced or looking that this is an opportunity to launch a new business venture, meet a new need that they didn't see happen before. So that was, I think, again, a positive. And some of that entrepreneurship certainly occurring in the education sector. In terms of learning pods or these pandemic pods, I wrote about this last summer as they were really gaining traction. A lot of teachers realized that they could make more money facilitating some of these learning pods with these groups of families than they could in the classroom and have a lot more flexibility in their own lives. So there was, more focus on that. There's a new education startup called Schoolhouse. I believe their URL is getschoolhouse.com. And that's this pod enabler. Basically, they'll connect a group of families in a community that wants to create one of these micro schools or these pods, and they'll connect them with a certified teacher. So there's another example of a startup that's really taken off over the past year and is meeting a lot of family needs.
I love that. I didn't even know that existed out there. But the thing I think people need to do is unplug from the TV because you just don't hear anything positive. You would think that children are just 2 and 3 years behind in school, never to catch up, and the parents are at their wits' end. They don't know what to do. I mean, this is a whole system of positivity that people need. I'm so happy you're on the show because people need to know this, that one, you're not alone, 2, there are options, and 3, they actually work well. That's a blessing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not to minimize the struggling that I think a lot of families have gone through over the past year for sure, but there are these silver linings. And I think one really positive aspect that's come out of the last year is renewed sense of parental empowerment. For the first time beginning last spring with the school shutdowns, for better or worse, parents were put back in charge of their kids and of their kids' education. And even if their kids were still doing remote schooling, they had a much closer look at what was happening in that environment. And I think a lot of them really, took that empowerment seriously and realized that it was a gift to be able to have more interaction and involvement with their children and really help to guide their children's education in ways that would have really been unimaginable for many of them prior to the pandemic. And we also see that over the last year, there's been increasing support for school choice policies. These would be education choice policies that would allow funding, for example, to follow students directly instead of funding school systems. So things like education savings accounts, tax credit scholarship programs, vouchers, and so on. That increasing support grew 10% from spring of 2020 to 77% in the fall of 2020. So already seeing 77% of respondents. This was a Real Clear Opinion research survey supporting education choice policies, and now we have active school choice legislation occurring in over 24 states to try to again kind of provide families with more options and help them to continue to feel empowered to guide their children's education and to find the best education environment for their kids, even when school shutdowns end.
I love it. Time goes so fast. We have a few seconds left. Once again, how can people buy your book and also read your what you've written online?
Right. So my book, again, is called Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom. You can find that at any local bookstore as well as any online retailers, Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, and so on. And you can also see a link to that, my other writing, and all my social media at fee.org/Kerry.
Ms. McDonald, you're awesome. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really enjoyed it, and I learned a great deal, and I feel optimistic for our children now.
Oh, I'm so glad. Yes, I am too. I think that with parental choice and parental empowerment really coming through this year, the future for children and families is bright.
I agree. On that note, let's end the show, and thank you, everybody, for living in the solution.
Revolutionary talk for revolutionary times. Liberty Talk FM.